The studio lights cast long shadows across the stage, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere that seemed fitting for what was about to unfold. The production team had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully crafting questions designed to make Clint Eastwood stumble into their narrative. They thought they had the perfect trap set for Hollywood's most iconic tough guy. Instead, they were about to become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating wisdom earned through decades of life experience. The air in the studio was electric with anticipation. Crew members whispered among themselves, adjusting equipment with nervous energy. They'd all heard the stories about Eastwood's notorious straightforwardness, his unwillingness to play the usual Hollywood games. Some of the younger staff members had even questioned whether having him on was a good idea, but Marcus Bennett, their star host, had insisted. This was going to be his moment, he'd said, the interview that would cement his reputation as the voice of a new generation. Clint Eastwood sat in the interview chair with the same quiet intensity that had made him a legend. At 93, he carried himself with a dignity that made everyone else in the room feel somehow younger and less substantial. The wrinkles on his face told stories of countless battles, both on and off screen, but his eyes, those same piercing eyes that had stared down countless villains, remained sharp and alert. He wore a simple black jacket over a light blue shirt, his usual no-nonsense attire that seemed to mock the carefully curated fashion statements surrounding him. The makeup artist had approached him tentatively before the show, brush in hand, but Eastwood had simply shaken his head. "What you see is what you get," he'd said, and something in his tone had made her step back without argument. Now he sat there, unpolished and real, a stark contrast to the glossy perfection of modern television. Across from him sat Marcus Bennett, the new face of progressive media, a rising star known for his ability to make guests squirm under the weight of their own words. His perfectly tailored suit and carefully styled hair stood in stark contrast to Eastwood's simple appearance. Bennett had made his name by taking down politicians, business leaders, and celebrities, expertly trapping them in their own contradictions. His show had become must-watch television for a certain demographic, people who delighted in seeing traditional figures struggle to defend their views in the modern world. The audience, a mix of Bennett's loyal followers and curious onlookers, waited in anticipation. Some already had their phones out, sensing that something memorable was about to happen. The younger members of the crowd, mostly in their 20s and 30s, wore expressions of smug anticipation. They'd seen Bennett in action before, watched him reduce supposedly powerful men to stammering messes. A few older audience members sat quietly, their faces harder to read. The floor director counted down silently with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red lights on the cameras blinked to life, and the studio monitors filled with the opening graphics of The Bennett Perspective, complete with its signature dramatic music and rapid-fire montage of headlines. "Mr. Eastwood," Bennett began, his voice carrying that practiced tone of false sincerity that had become his trademark. "You've spent decades portraying what many would call the quintessential American male archetype, the strong, silent type, the man who lets his actions speak louder than words. But in today's world, don't you think that kind of masculinity is problematic?" A few audience members nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The word problematic hung in the air like a challenge. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged knowing looks. This was how it always started, with a seemingly innocent question designed to put the guest on the defensive. Eastwood didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Bennett with the same measured gaze that had made Dirty Harry an icon. The silence stretched long enough to make the host's smile waver slightly. In that moment, the dynamic in the room began to shift, though Bennett didn't realize it yet. This wasn't going to be like his other interviews. "Problematic," Eastwood finally repeated, drawing out the word like he was tasting something bitter. "That's an interesting word choice." His voice, though older now, still carried that gravelly authority that had commanded attention for over half a century. "Tell me something. What exactly is the problem with being strong?" Bennett leaned forward, sensing what he thought was an opening. "Well, in an era where we're trying to promote emotional intelligence and vulnerability, don't you think this old-school tough guy mentality contributes to toxic behavior patterns?" Eastwood's response was a quiet chuckle that somehow filled the entire studio. You know what's toxic? He asked, his voice low but clear. Telling young men that being strong is something to be ashamed of, that standing up for what you believe in is somehow wrong, that protecting your family and your principles is outdated. The audience fell completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. In the control room, the director's fingers hovered over the switching board, uncertain whether to cut to a wide shot or stay on the close-up of Eastwood's weathered face. Bennett's carefully constructed narrative was already beginning to unravel, and they were only minutes into the interview. But surely, Bennett tried again, his voice slightly less confident now, you must acknowledge that society has evolved beyond the need for this kind of traditional masculinity. Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, and in that moment, everyone in the room was reminded of why he had become an icon. Society has evolved, he repeated, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Tell that to the men and women serving in our military. Tell that to the police officers patrolling our streets. Tell that to the firefighters running into burning buildings. Tell that to the single parents working 3 jobs to keep food on the table. You want to know what real evolution is? It's not sitting in an air-conditioned studio telling people they're wrong for being strong. The first part of the interview wasn't even over, but already clips were being uploaded to social media. In homes across America, people were stopping what they were doing to watch their screens more closely. Something was happening, something real, and everyone could feel it. The carefully orchestrated takedown was transforming into something else entirely. A moment of genuine truth in a world of carefully crafted narratives. Bennett tried to regain control of the conversation, shuffling his note cards with practiced precision. The studio lights seemed to burn a little brighter now, and beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead. This wasn't the first time an interview had taken an unexpected turn, but something felt different. The usual tactics weren't working. But surely you must acknowledge that times have changed, Bennett pressed, his voice carrying a slight edge of desperation. The kind of characters you've played, the lone gunslinger, the tough cop who doesn't play by the rules, they represent a kind of masculine ideal that many argue perpetuates violence and aggression. How do you respond to critics who say these roles have contributed to harmful stereotypes? Eastwood leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that suggested he'd seen this coming from a mile away. Let me tell you something about change, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. I've been in this business for over 60 years. I've seen all kinds of changes, some good, some not so good. But there's one thing that hasn't changed, the need for people who are willing to stand up for what's right. He paused, taking a sip of water from the glass on the small table beside him. The audience hung on every word, the usual rustling and whispers completely absent. Even the perpetual glow of phone screens had dimmed as people became too engrossed to post on social media. You know what's interesting? Eastwood continued, setting down his glass with deliberate care. You mentioned my characters, the gunslinger, the cop, the soldier, but you're missing the point entirely. Those weren't just tough guys with guns. They were men facing moral choices in difficult situations. They were people who had to decide whether to stand up or stand aside. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Bennett's producer was speaking rapidly into his earpiece, but the host seemed unsure whether to interrupt or let Eastwood continue. Take Unforgiven, Eastwood went on, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. That wasn't just a Western about revenge. It was about the cost of violence, about the weight of our choices, or Gran Torino. That wasn't about being tough. It was about sacrifice, about protecting those who can't protect themselves. But you people, he gestured vaguely at Bennett and his production team, you only see what you want to see. Bennett shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation was developing. But don't you think we need to move beyond this idea that strength equals violence? That maybe there are other ways to resolve conflicts? Of course there are other ways, Eastwood responded, his trademark squint becoming more pronounced. But let me ask you something. When someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night, are you going to try to have a meaningful dialogue with them? When someone threatens your family, are you going to suggest meditation? The audience erupted in scattered laughter and applause. Bennett's face flushed slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. Behind the cameras, producers were frantically gesturing, trying to guide their host back to safer ground. That's a rather extreme example, don't you think? Bennett countered, attempting to regain control of the narrative. We're talking about everyday interactions, about changing the culture of masculinity. Eastwood leaned forward, his presence somehow becoming even more commanding. No, what you're talking about is weakening society under the guise of progress. You want to know what real toxic masculinity is? It's not being strong. It's not being protective. It's not standing up for what you believe in. Real toxic masculinity is telling men that all those things are wrong. He paused, looking directly at a young man in the audience who had been nodding along with Bennett earlier. You know what I see today? I see young men afraid to be men. I see people so worried about being called toxic that they forget to be strong. And who benefits from that? Not them, not their families, not society. The young man looked down, unable to hold Eastwood's gaze. In the control room, the director was switching between camera angles rapidly, trying to capture every nuance of this unexpected confrontation. Let me tell you something about strength, Eastwood continued, his voice taking on a passionate edge that no one had expected from the usually reserved actor. Real strength isn't about bullying. It's not about domination. It's about having the courage to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about doing what's right, even when it's not popular. The studio atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Bennett's usual supporters in the audience were unusually quiet, while others were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on Eastwood's every word. The host's perfectly pressed suit seemed to have lost some of its crispness, his carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration. Let's talk about your directing career, Bennett said, forcing a smile as he tried a different approach. You've had the opportunity to shape narratives, to influence how people think about strength and justice. Don't you feel a responsibility to promote more modern, more inclusive ideas of heroism? Eastwood's response was immediate and sharp. You want to know what real inclusion is? It's giving people the chance to be strong, not telling them that strength is wrong. It's allowing people to stand up for themselves, not teaching them to be victims. He shifted in his chair, his eyes scanning the audience before continuing. You know, I've directed all kinds of stories, not just westerns or action films. I made Bird about Charlie Parker. I made Million Dollar Baby about a female boxer. I made Letters from Iwo Jima telling the story from the Japanese perspective. You know why those films worked? Because they were honest. They didn't try to push an agenda. They showed real people facing real challenges. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously, and Eastwood turned his attention to her. Take Million Dollar Baby. That wasn't just about boxing. It was about determination, about fighting for your dreams against all odds. Was Maggie Fitzgerald toxic because she was tough? Was she problematic because she wanted to fight? Bennett attempted to interject, but Eastwood held up a hand, his authority so natural that even the host fell silent. I've been in this business a long time, Eastwood continued, his voice taking on a reflective tone. I've seen trends come and go. I've seen what happens when people try to force change instead of letting it happen naturally. You know what the problem is today? Everyone's so busy trying to tear down the old that they forget to build something better in its place. In the control room, producers were frantically discussing whether to cut to commercial, but they knew it would be pointless. This moment was too raw, too real to interrupt. You mentioned responsibility earlier, Eastwood said, fixing Bennett with his signature stare. Let me tell you about responsibility. It's not about following trends or saying what people want to hear. It's about telling the truth, even when it's not popular. It's about showing life as it is, not as some people wish it would be. He paused, taking another sip of water. The silence in the studio was absolute. You know what I've learned from directing? The best stories, the ones that really matter, they're not about being politically correct. They're about being honest. When I made American Sniper, people criticized it for glorifying war. But anyone who actually watched the film knew it was about the cost of war, about the burden that our soldiers carry. That's the kind of truth we need more of, not less. Bennett, sensing his carefully planned interview slipping further away, tried one more time to regain control. But surely you must admit, he ventured, that this kind of thinking can be dangerous in today's world, that it might encourage people to take matters into their own hands rather than trust in systems and institutions? The look Eastwood gave him could have melted steel. You want to talk about danger? I'll tell you what's dangerous. It's dangerous when we start telling people they can't think for themselves. It's dangerous when we start saying that strength is wrong and weakness is right. It's dangerous when we create a society where everyone's so afraid of offending someone that they forget how to stand up for anything. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the studio. You know what I think? I think people like you are scared. Scared of real strength, scared of individuals who can think for themselves, scared of people who don't need your approval to know they're right. The impact of the interview was immediate and seismic. Within hours of the broadcast, clips were spreading across social media platforms with the velocity of a digital wildfire. Clint Eastwood destroys woke media became the top trending topic across multiple platforms. But this was different from the usual viral moments. There was something raw, something authentic that resonated with people across the political spectrum. The moment when he asked Bennett about home invasion became an instant meme, shared millions of times with captions like, "Real Talk with Clint," and "When Hollywood Actually Speaks Truth." But beyond the memes and viral clips, a deeper conversation was beginning to emerge. People weren't just sharing sound bites. They were engaging in serious discussions about strength, responsibility, and the direction of modern society. Bennett's network scrambled to control the narrative, releasing carefully worded statements about fostering meaningful dialogue and respecting diverse perspectives. Their PR team worked overtime, trying to spin the interview as a thoughtful exchange of ideas between generations. But anyone who had watched the full interview knew better. This hadn't been an exchange. It had been an exposure, a moment when the carefully constructed facade of modern media had cracked to reveal the emptiness behind it. Veterans began sharing their stories on social media, talking about what real strength meant in combat situations. Police officers posted about the importance of mental toughness when facing life and death decisions. Firefighters shared experiences about the need for both physical and emotional strength in their line of work. A viral post from a single mother in Detroit captured the mood perfectly. Eastwood gets it. Being tough isn't about violence. It's about not giving up when everything is stacked against you. I've raised 3 kids on my own, worked 2 jobs, and never asked for pity. That's the kind of strength he's talking about. The interview's impact rippled through popular culture in unexpected ways. Streaming services reported a surge in views of classic Eastwood films, but not just the action movies. Million Dollar Baby, Gran Torino, and Letters from Iwo Jima saw massive spikes in viewership as people began to understand what Eastwood had been trying to say about strength and character all along. Young people, particularly those who had never really engaged with Eastwood's work, began sharing clips from his films with new perspectives. A 19-year-old's TikTok analysis of the moral complexity in Unforgiven went viral, sparking discussions about the difference between movie violence and real-world strength. Film schools reported increased interest in studying Eastwood's directorial work, not just for its technical merits but for its themes of moral courage and personal responsibility. Meanwhile, Eastwood himself remained characteristically quiet about the viral moment. When finally cornered by reporters outside his favorite golf club in Carmel, California, he simply shrugged and said, "I just said what needed to be said. Nothing more, nothing less." The reporters pressed him for more, but he just smiled and went back to his game, embodying the very principles he had defended in the interview. The conversation he had started continued to evolve. It wasn't just about masculinity anymore. It had become a broader discussion about authenticity in a world of performance, about real strength in an era of carefully curated weakness. People began questioning the difference between genuine progress and performative change, between actual strength and artificial posturing. Bennett's show saw its ratings decline steadily in the following months. The host tried to adapt, to show more understanding of traditional viewpoints, but his audience could sense the insincerity. Meanwhile, a new wave of media personalities emerged, ones who weren't afraid to challenge prevailing narratives about strength and character. They didn't try to copy Eastwood's style. They had learned the more important lesson about being authentic to oneself. The interview became a cultural touchstone, referenced in discussions about everything from education to leadership. Academic papers were written analyzing the interaction between Eastwood and Bennett as a metaphor for the larger cultural divide in society. But perhaps more importantly, it sparked real changes in how people thought about strength and character. Martial arts dojos reported increased enrollment, not just from people wanting to learn self-defense, but from those seeking to understand the mental discipline that came with training. Community organizations saw a surge in volunteers, particularly for programs that combined physical challenges with character building. Parents began questioning educational approaches that prioritized comfort over growth. 1 year after the interview, a documentary filmmaker asked Eastwood if he had known the impact his words would have. The 93-year-old legend thought for a moment before responding. "You know what the problem is with our world today? Everyone's so busy trying to make a statement that they forget to tell the truth. I just told the truth." The documentary never aired. Eastwood didn't like the attention. But those words spread anyway, becoming yet another piece of wisdom from a man who had spent decades telling stories about strength, honor, and the courage to stand up for what you believe in. As one viral comment put it, they thought they were going to expose Eastwood. Instead, he exposed everything wrong with modern media in less than an hour. The truth, as it turned out, was still as powerful as any line Eastwood had ever delivered on screen, maybe even more so. In an age of carefully crafted narratives and manufactured controversies, real strength had proven to be the most compelling story of all. The legacy of that interview continues to resonate, not because it was a perfect takedown of modern media, but because it was a moment of genuine truth in a world starving for authenticity. Clint Eastwood, at 93, had done more than just win an interview. He had reminded America that some values don't need to be reimagined or rebranded. They just need to be remembered.